Pannekoek and Castoriadis on the Question of Stalinism by Christos Memos. The history of the Russian Revolution dominated Marxist and radical politics throughout the 20th century. It also set the context for intense political and theoretical juxtapositions. In particular, the interpretation of the class character of the Soviet Union gave rise to much controversy and was inseparably linked with the issue of Stalinism. Yet what was highly problematic in most of these approaches was that their positions reflected the political expediencies, sectarianism, and dogmatism of the fragmented labor movement. Thus they failed not only to function in a situation of mutual recognition, critical solidarity, and open criticism, but also to provide a radically satisfactory answer to the Russian question. Unfortunately, even in present-day critical theory and within the radical movement, it appears that the questions concerning the nature of Stalinism do not attract much attention. As a result, liberals and conservatives have been able to appropriate the history of the Russian Revolution by presenting the tragedy of Stalinism as the absolute and irredeemable failure of socialism. More importantly, the inability of the anti-capitalist movement to draw the necessary and inescapable conclusions from its own past struggles and failures constrains the formation of a radical alternative to capitalism. This paper argues that the Soviet experience and the issue of Stalinism need an imperative and much more careful and critical rethinking. There is within the radical tradition a valuable theoretical legacy that has to be reconsidered and further developed. To this end, the aim of this article is to discuss the critique of the Stalinism provided by Anton Pannekoek and Cornelius Castoriadis. It explores their short exchange of letters on this topic and proceeds analytically to outline their positions in regard to the Stalinist phenomenon. The paper concludes by critically examining the limits and merits of their approaches. Okay, that was like the abstract. There's a little poem here. So much suffering, so much life went into the abyss, all for an empty tunic, all for a Helen. This is by George Seferis Helen. Oh no, the poem's called Helen. It's by George Seferis. Okay. End of poem that I read with such charm and sincerity. Since the outbreak of the Russian Revolution of 1917, both its supporters and its opponents have argued over the class character of the Soviet Union. Different scholars and political trends have tended to emphasize different features of the Soviet regime. Within this debate, the issue of Stalinism has occupied a central position and has given rise to much controversy between Marxists and non-Marxists in intellectual and political circles. Exactly what was the Stalinist system? Non-Marxists tend to identify the Russian Revolution with Stalinism and attempt to demonstrate the impasse and the totalitarian character of the Soviet system. They emphasize the dictatorial character of the Soviet Union, while at the same time they wrongly identify the Soviet Union or compare it with the fascist regimes. Through this prism, the collapse of the USSR was seen as the victory and superiority of, quote, Western liberal democracy, end quote. A world market society had been created, and the triumph of, quote, free markets, end quote, was pronounced. According to neoliberal Sovietologists, history had come to an end, and any radical alternative to capitalism has to be perceived as inconceivable and a dangerous illusion. On the other hand, the vast majority of traditional leftists and Marxists consider the Russian question as, quote, done, end quote, finished, end quote, as a historical event that belongs to the past and a variant of state capitalism. In many cases, they appear unwilling to provide, or rather are incapable of providing, a satisfactory analysis of the Stalinist phenomenon. Even 20 years after the demise of the Soviet system, they avoid probing deeply into the study of the Soviet social formation. In other cases, Stalinism has been used as a scapegoat in an effort to dissociate the ultimate outcome of Soviet society from any relevance to orthodox Marxism or the traditional left. Thus, what is left from the Russian Revolution? Have all these struggles, all these sacrifices been in vain? Did so much suffering, pain, and hope go into the abyss? Was it all for the, quote, empty tunic, end quote, of Stalinism, and Gorbachev's final verdict that it is not socialism, but rather pizza that is important, as it is good for socializing and beneficial for people? Instead of fleeing from Stalinism, leftist parties and scholars chose to flee from Marx and from any theoretical endeavor to critically explain Stalinism and re-examine the, quote, Russian enigma, end quote. By ignoring the unity of theory and practice and degrading the role of theory, quote, practice became non-conceptual, a piece of politics it was supposed to lead out of. It became the prey of power, end quote. Even after the emergence of the movement against neoliberal globalization, practicism and tacticism remained dominant within it. Yet the inability to provide a satisfactory explanation of Stalinism and interpret the course and demise of the Soviet-type societies perpetuates the crisis of the radical movement. It also blocks any attempt to create a radical alternative to capitalism, as the vast majority of people have associated and equated socialism with Stalinism, oppression, and fear. Could this attitude of the traditional left and the, quote, Marxist, end quote, mainstream academics be explicated as owing to the fact, as Plato would say, that, quote, you should hesitate to change the style of your literature because you risk everything if you do, end quote? Or is it the case that this reluctance to reflect upon the Russian question, this theoretical inadequacy and failure suggests that, as Lukács put it, quote, we are all still Stalinists, end quote? Yet does not, quote, risk everything, end quote, constitute a potential implication of Marx's favorite motto, quote, doubt everything, end quote, regardless of the consequences it may lead to? Marx very emphatically argued that, quote, we do not attempt dogmatically to prefigure the future, but we want to find a new world only through criticism of the old, end quote. And by rejecting, quote, ready-made solutions, end quote, he called for a, quote, ruthless criticism of everything existing, ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be, end quote. On this basis, the development and collapse of the Soviet system require much profound thought, since the Russian Revolution was and remains a focal point for radical practice and theory, and the renewal of struggle in order to map out the responses to the challenges of neoliberal globalization and form a radical alternative society to capitalism. Until now, ideological passions and political interests seem to have drawn an overly sharp boundary between the different Marxist and radical approaches to the former USSR. All these critical appraisals and theoretical traditions, however, could constitute an internal dialogue, contributing in this way to the elucidation of the Soviet model. Such a discussion could serve as an invaluable source of knowledge and allow valuable lessons to be drawn from the Soviet experience. This paper argues that there is a neglected intellectual heritage regarding the issue of Stalinism that stands in need of being brought to the surface and reconsidered. In this sense, it focuses on this claim by discussing the critique of the Soviet Union and Stalinism developed by Anton Pannekoek and Cornelius Castoriadis. First, it presents the relatively unknown exchange of letters regarding the nature of the Russian Revolution and the class character of the Soviet Union. Expounding on this debate, the essay goes on to outline their viewpoints on the question of Stalinism. It concludes by challenging their views through a critical and contemporary reading of their positions. An exchange of letters between Pannekoek and Castoriadis. Under the impact of Stalin's death and the uprising in East Germany in 1953, Marxist and radical scholars took up in a more determined and drastic manner a discussion carried out earlier regarding the nature of Soviet society, the role of the Communist Party, and the issue regarding the crisis of Marxism. It was widely recognized that both Marxist theory and practice were in crisis, and the ruling ideology of Stalinism was fiercely criticized. The institutionalization of Marxism reduced it to a reformist and established ideology marked by fatalism, positivism, and technicism. Marxism had developed into a completed theory and a closed theoretical system. In most cases, the crisis of Marxism was identified with the crisis of the Soviet-type societies. According to Ernst Bloch, quote, crisis is an old term for a burden, for rejecting that burden, end quote. Bloch's definition of crisis manages to conceptualize the vantage point from which the Marxist scholars dealt with the crisis of Marxism. To a large extent, it was argued that Stalinism was a, quote, burden, end quote, that renounced and denied fundamental Marxian positions. It also remained an obstacle in the path of a radical social transformation of Western societies. It was a period that sparked a profound reorientation of Marxist theory, and Stalinism was seen as a determining factor in the crisis of Marxism, since Stalinism had resulted in the establishment of a new authoritarian, suppressive, and exploitive state, that is, the Soviet regime. This in turn implied remarkable efforts to explicate the Stalinist phenomenon with a view to rejecting the burden which, like a nightmare, had been haunting both Marxism and the labor movement. Against this background, in 1953 and 1954, Anton Pannekoek and Cornelius Castoriadis, in a short exchange of letters, broached, along with the organizational issue, the theme of the Russian Revolution and its class character. In his letter on 8th of October 1953, Pannekoek made it explicit that, almost from the outset of the revolution, Pannekoek, quote, recognized in Russia a nascent capitalism, end quote. Considering that the Russian Revolution had a powerful impact upon people's consciousness, he argued that a more profound and penetrating analysis of its nature was needed. In this line of thought, Pannekoek maintained that the Russian Revolution was the, quote, last bourgeois revolution, though carried out by the working class, end quote. According to Pannekoek, a revolution can be named a bourgeois, end quote, According to Pannekoek, a revolution can be named as, quote, bourgeois, end quote, when by overthrowing feudalism and monarchy it contributes to the process of industrial transformation and establishes new capitalist social relations. As was the case with the English Revolution of 1847 and the French Revolution of 1789, or those of 1830, 1848, and 1871, workers, peasants, and artisans played a crucial role in the radical change of feudal society. Yet they remain the ruled and exploited class, since, quote, the working class was not yet mature enough to govern itself, end quote. In the same way, the Russian Revolution appeared to be a proletarian revolution that was conducted through the collective militancy and mass strikes of the working class. Gradually, however, and owing to the fact the proletariat constituted a minority in the whole Russian population, the Bolshevik Party managed to usurp the workers' power and suppress any autonomous revolutionary activity. As a result, quote, the bourgeois character in the largest sense of the term became dominant and took the form of state capitalism, end quote. In support of his line of argument, Pannekoek turned to the question and definition of the proletarian revolution by seeing the future proletarian revolution as a, quote, process, end quote, and not as a, quote, simple rebellion, end quote, a, quote, event, end quote, or a military seizure of power. Pannekoek argued that the workers' revolution is, quote, much more vast and profound. It is the accession of the mass of the people to the consciousness of their existence and their character. It will not be a simple convulsion. It will form the content of an entire period in the history of humanity, end quote. In his reply published in Socialism ou Barbarie in April 1954, Castoriadis pinpointed their differences vis-à-vis the nature of the Russian Revolution. According to Castoriadis, to consider it a bourgeois revolution amounts to a distortion of the facts, ideas, and language. Following Castoriadis' view, the Russian Revolution was a proletarian revolution as the working class has a critical and dominant role in it. The Russian proletariat had its own demands and developed its own forms of struggle and organization. Castoriadis stressed stresses that the disagreement with Pannekoek is due to a different methodological approach taken to the issue of bureaucracy. The degeneration of the Russian Revolution did not result in the restoration of the bourgeoisie, but in the emergence of a new exploiting stratum, the bureaucracy. In this sense, and despite the similarities they have in common, the new Soviet regime is distinct from capitalist societies. In his reply to Castoriadis, Pannekoek pointed out, in contradistinction to what happened in the English Revolution, in Russia there was no strong bourgeois class. Consequently, a new, quote, middle class, end quote, emerged from the revolutionary avant-garde, managing the economy and administering the means of production. As a general rule, according to Pannekoek, if the working classes are still not capable of exerting full control over production, then this will inescapably lead to the dominance of a new managerial class. In Russia, the conditions were not sufficiently mature for the outbreak of a genuine proletarian revolution. Thus, the Bolshevik Party, a party which was influenced by Marxism, was obliged to seize power, and this resulted in Stalinist totalitarianism. This interpretation of Stalinism, however, appears insufficient and cannot be fully grasped if there is no further elucidation. This interpretation of Stalinism, however, appears insufficient and cannot be fully grasped if there is no further elucidation of Pannekoek's and Castoriadis' contribution to the explication of the class nature of the Soviet Union. Pannekoek and the Russian Revolution. A theoretical trend known as, quote, council communism, end quote, emerged in Germany and Holland in the 1920s and expressed both theoretically and politically a significant part of the left-wing communist movement during this period by regarding the workers' councils as the appropriate means for fighting against capitalism and creating a new society of free and equal associated producers. The significance of council communism, quote, lay in the attempt by Marxists to express at the level of theory and program the new forms of proletarian struggle emerging in the early years of the 20th century, end quote. Thus, in their attempt to illuminate the new issues the proletarian struggle had to deal with, they inevitably questioned the actual class character of the Soviet social formation. Despite their initial warm and enthusiastic reception of the Russian Revolution, it should be noted that initially the, quote, council theory grew out of the opposition to Bolshevism, end quote, and as a result, quote, the critique of the Russian Revolution was undertaken to demonstrate the inapplicability of the Bolshevik model of revolution to advanced capitalist countries, end quote. Pannekoek, who is one of the most representative figures within the council communist tendency, in 1919 made the claim that, quote, in Russia, communism has been put into practice for 2 years now, end quote. 1 year later, Pannekoek pointed out that the revolution in Western Europe would be quite different from the Russian one and argued against the, quote, equation of the conditions, parties, organizations, and parliamentary practice of Western Europe with their Russian counterparts, end quote. In particular, after Lenin's publication of left-wing communism and infantile disorder, both the Bolshevik Party and the Third International were judged as opportunists. They were also criticized for making compromises with the capitalist world and for not providing support for revolution in the other European countries. From Pannekoek's point of view, the political system of Russia was controlled by a, quote, workers', end quote, bureaucracy based on a council system, end quote. Oh shit. From Pannekoek's point of view, the political system of Russia was controlled by a, quote, workers' bureaucracy based on a council system, end quote, and should be seen not as the outcome of a proletarian revolution, but as a, quote, temporary, inadequate transitional form, end quote, of organization. This, quote, stratum in power, end quote, reinforced the bourgeois policies all over the world and led world revolution to stagnation. Later on, in 1936, Pannekoek made the claim that in the Russian Revolution, the party bureaucracy came to power as the ruling caste, end quote. It is in this year, however, that Pannekoek maintained that a system of state capitalism was developed in Russia under the control of the bureaucracy of the Russian government owing to the absence of a powerful bourgeoisie before the outbreak of the revolution. As a result, Russia was transformed from a semi-barbarian to a developed capitalist country that in some aspects was more advanced even than Western private capitalism. Yet, what is distinctive about Pannekoek's approach is the fact that, unlike Trotsky and Trotskyists, he did not endeavor to explicate the class nature of the Soviet system by starting with a critique of the Stalinist period, but he channeled his effort into investigating the first years of the Russian Revolution. Hence, Pannekoek focused his critique on Lenin by criticizing not only his political tactics, but also his theoretical and philosophical thought. More specifically, in his work, Lenin as Philosopher, Pannekoek argued that, quote, in Russia, a system of state capitalism consolidated itself not by deviating from, but by following Lenin's ideas, e.g., in his State and Revolution, A new dominating and exploiting class came into power over the working class, but at the same time Marxism was fostered and proclaimed the fundamental basis of the Russian state, end quote. In Pannekoek's view, Lenin's philosophical thought, as it had been chiefly expounded in his Materialism and Empirio-criticism, quote, proclaimed the official state philosophy, end quote, of the new state capitalism established in Russia. Under the name of, quote, Leninism, end quote, this state philosophy was a, quote, combination of middle-class materialism and the Marxian doctrine of social development adorned with some dialectic terminology, end quote. Lenin not only distorted Marx and Avenarius's notion, but he also appeared to be unable to criticize them from a Marxian perspective. In his critique of their work, Lenin made no use of historical materialism, but employed bourgeois materialism to defend his theses. For Pannekoek, the Bolshevist theory consisted of two key elements, that is to say, quote, middle-class materialism in its basic philosophy, end quote, proletarian evolutionism in its doctrine of class fight, end quote. This explains why the Russian Revolution constituted a combination of two aspects, quote, middle-class revolution in its immediate aims, end quote, and, quote, proletarian revolution in its active forces, end quote. Not surprisingly, according to Pannekoek, Lenin's philosophical ideas were consistent with his social and political positions. As Paul Maddock pointed out, Pannekoek argued that Lenin's middle-class materialism, quote, went together with the state capitalist concept of, quote, socialism, end quote, with the authoritarian attitudes towards spontaneity and organization, with the outdated and unrealizable principle of national self-determination, and with Lenin's conviction that only the middle-class intelligentsia is able to develop a revolutionary consciousness and is thus destined to lead the masses. The combination of bourgeois materialism and revolutionary Marxism, which characterized Lenin's philosophy, reappeared with the victorious Bolshevism as the combination of neo-capitalist practice and socialist ideology, end quote. Paul Maddock. Leninism was thus perceived by Pannekoek as a, quote, theory of middle-class revolution installing a new ruling class. Sorry, one second. Seen through this prism, for Pannekoek, there are no genuine Marxist principles of Lenin and old Bolshevism that could be opposed to the authoritarian policies of Stalinism. Lenin was not a real Marxist, and the Russian Bolshevism, quote, cannot be reproached for having abandoned the way of Marxism, for it was never on that way, end quote. Accordingly, what Trotskyist and the left opposition called Stalinism was actually a continuation of Lenin's politics. All the despotic and repressive Stalinist practices, quote, were inaugurated already by Lenin, end quote. According to Pannekoek, certain aspects of Stalinism could be traced back to Lenin's conception of party, iron discipline, centralism, hierarchy, and blind obedience to party, emasculated the working class movement and led to the dominance of state and party officials who took control over production and regulated labor from above. At times, Pannekoek's critique of the Leninist conception of the party resonates with Luxemburg's critique of Lenin's centralism. Since 1904, Rosa Luxemburg had warned Lenin and the Bolsheviks that, quote, social democratic centralism cannot be based on the mechanical subordination and blind obedience of the party membership to the leading party center, end quote. In response to Lenin's, quote, factory schooling, end quote, and his glorification of the educative role of factory discipline, Luxemburg argued that, quote, the self-discipline of the social democracy is not merely the replacement of the authority of the bourgeois rulers with the authority of socialist... Quote, Jesus Christ. Restart. Take some backward steps. Take a deep breath. In response to Lenin's, quote, factory schooling, end quote, and his glorification of the educative role of factory discipline, Luxemburg argued that, quote, the self-discipline of the social democracy is not merely the replacement of the authority of the bourgeois rulers with the authority of a socialist central committee. The working class will acquire the sense of the new discipline, the freely assumed self-discipline of the social democracy, end quote. Going on to question Lenin's theses regarding the function of the Bolshevik Party, Luxemburg opposed the conservatism and absolute power of the Central Committee, concluding that, quote, the ultra-centralism asked by Lenin is full of sterile spirit of the overseer. The sterile spirit of the overseer. It is not a positive and creative spirit. Lenin's concern is not so much to make the activity of the party more fruitful as to control the party, to narrow the movement rather than to develop it, to bind rather than to unify it. End quote. Luxemburg. And that's from The Organizational Question of Russian Social Democracy. It should be noted here that on this issue, and in a parallel way, Trotsky called Lenin, quote, head of the reactionary wing of our party, end quote, and quite prophetically warned that Leninist methods would transform the party into a mechanism in which, quote, the organization of the party takes the place of the party itself, the Central Committee takes the place of the organization, and finally the dictator takes the place of the Central Committee, end quote. Expanding and radicalizing Luxemburg's positions, Pannekoek pointed out that the, quote, very expression, quote, revolutionary party, end quote, is a contradiction in terms, end quote. The non-revolutionary Bolshevik Party got mastery over Russian society and created an economic system that is, quote, state capitalism. They're called state socialism or even communism, end quote. Labor and production are directed by a, quote, state bureaucracy under the leadership of the Communist Party. The state officials forming the new ruling class have the disposal over the product, hence over the surplus value, whereas the workers receive wages only, thus forming an exploited class, end quote. Pannekoek. In his major work, Workers' Councils, Pannekoek characterized the economic system developed in Russia as, quote, state capitalism, end quote. The Soviet state was seen as a, quote, universal employer, end quote, a, quote, mammoth capitalist, end quote, that exploits and enslaves the working class. The leading bureaucrats, the new ruling class, own the means of production collectively and have addressed themselves to the task of industrializing a, quote, primitive, barbarous country, end quote, and increasing labor productivity. They fulfill in Russia a function comparable to what the bourgeoisie did in Western Europe and America. This, in turn, according to Pannekoek, implies that the names state capitalism and state socialism, quote, can be applied with precisely the same meaning, end quote. Within this context, the Stalinist practices were described as, quote, primitive forms of noisy propaganda, end quote, and, quote, party terrorism, not only spiritual, but also physical, against dissenting views, end quote. The Russian leaders acted so, apparently on the ground that they ignored, quote, the sources of strength that lie hidden in the modern working class, end quote. It is this line of argument that enables Pannekoek to interpret Stalinism as the result of the, quote, middle-class character, end quote, of the Russian Revolution. Hence, the paradox or anomaly of the Stalinist period could be clarified as a revival of the, quote, old traditions of middle-class revolutions, with the preponderance of great leaders, of sounding catchwords, of conspiracies, plots, and military revolts, end quote. Throughout this period, the proletariat was heavily exploited in this middle-class bureaucracy using a dictatorial form of government. This new privileged social category was not a, quote, new bourgeoisie, end quote, but it was a, quote, new ruling class, end quote, that, quote, had risen from the working class and the peasants, including former officials, by ability, luck, and cunning, end quote. Yet despite the decay of revolution, the promotion of repressive practices, the subjection of the working class, and the gradual restoration of capitalism, quote, the name of Soviet Republic was preserved as a camouflage, and the ruling party retained the name of Communist Party, end quote. Pannekoek, Workers' Councils. Quote, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, 4 letters, 4 lies, end quote. Castoriadis' statement used as the heading of this section characteristically expresses his general perception regarding the Soviet regime. Indeed, as Castoriadis pointed out, the USSR was a non-revolutionary, quote, union, end quote, based on violence and terror, and an authoritarian state that pulverized Soviets and workers' councils. Nevertheless, he firmly believed that the, quote, Russian question was and remains the touchstone of the theoretical and practical attitudes that call for revolution, and this question was also the richest vein, the royal road to the comprehension of the most important problems of contemporary society, end quote. For this reason, he was deeply engaged in studying the, quote, Russian question, end quote, although his theoretical attitude towards it was not stable but passed through several stages. Starting his political and theoretical itinerary within the Trotskyist movement, Castoriadis came to put Trotsky's interpretation of Stalinism as well as his analysis of the class nature of the USSR into question. While Castoriadis was still living in Greece, he expressed a strong interest in the phenomenon of bureaucracy by studying and writing on the thought of Max Weber. Later on in France, the efforts he made to explicate the class nature of the USSR were initially linked to his questioning of the Trotskyist theory of the Soviet regime. Later on in France, the efforts he made to explicate the class nature of the USSR were initially linked to his questioning of the Trotskyist theory of the Soviet regime. Castoriadis argued not only against the defense of the USSR, but also against the designation of the Soviet regime as a degenerated worker state or state capitalism by calling his attempt, quote, a return to the genuine spirit of Marx's analysis, end quote. He attempted to demystify the juridical forms of Soviet society and analyze the social and production relations of the system. Under the veil of state ownership and central planning, he saw a new ruling and dominant class which held political power and exercised it for its own interests, the Soviet bureaucracy. The Soviet regime, as Castoriadis maintained, quote, constitutes a new historical formation, end quote. Quote, a third historical solution, end quote. It is, quote, neither capitalist nor socialist, nor even moving forward either one of these two forms, end quote. Castoriadis refused to identify Stalinism with any version of capitalism, private or state, and was of the opinion that the Soviet society and economy, quote, presents us with a new historical type. Its name is of little importance once its substance is known, end quote. Afterwards, and more specifically in 1948 and in 1949, Castoriadis observed that modern societies were characterized by a, quote, need to concentrate the forces of production, end quote, and that, quote, a continual merger of capital and the state on a national and international scale, end quote, had emerged in both the United States and the USSR, although not without differences. In this world situation, the bureaucracy appeared as a new social stratum and replaced the traditional bourgeoisie. This social formation pre-existed in, quote, embryonic form, end quote, but now, quote, for the first time in history, crystallized and established itself as the ruling class in a whole series of countries, end quote. Simultaneously, new economic forms appeared that differed, quote, significantly from traditional capitalism in that they have superseded and broken radically with such traditional capitalist forms as the private ownership of the means of production, end quote. Following this line of thought, Castoriadis went on to claim that the bureaucracy, quote, was the social expression of these new economic forms, end quote, and to challenge orthodox Marxist approaches by arguing that, quote, As traditional forms of property in the bourgeoisie of the classical period are pushed aside by state property and by the bureaucracy, the main conflict within society gradually ceases to be the old one between the owners of wealth and those without property, and is replaced by the conflict between directors and executants in the process of production. End quote. I guess it's executants, not executants. But executant sounds fun. Anyway, end of quote. Cornelius Castoriadis. Castoriadis acknowledged all these global developments as some characteristics common to all industrial societies: the fusion of state and economy, the concentration of capital, and the bureaucratization of societies. All these trends were likely to lead the two systems, the American and the Russian, to a convergence in the absence of the labor movement's intervention. Such a unification of the two systems, quote, would result in a worldwide system of exploitation of the laboring masses, end quote. On these criteria, Castoriadis called these systems, quote, bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, and noted that they constituted the continuation of traditional capitalism. Later on, Castoriadis characterized the social regime of Russia as a, quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, and the Western developed countries as, quote, fragmented bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. According to Andrew Arato, I think, is the first name, Andrew Arato, because I'm a genius. Know everything. According to Arato, Castoriadis utilized the concept of, quote, bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, after 1948 for both Russia and Western countries in an attempt to, quote, save the Marxian philosophy of history that his first model brought under threat, end quote. Yet Castoriadis articulated his distinct approach by criticizing the Marxist interpretations of the Soviet Union, since, quote, the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic regime remain for them thoroughly impossible as objects of thought, end quote. Castoriadis' position is that total bureaucratic capitalism is not compatible with any reference to the existence and function of economic laws. Consequently, quote, conceptions that see in Russia a kind of, quote, state capitalism, end quote, and that claim that the, quote, economic laws of capitalism, end quote, continue to prevail, with a simple substitution of the state for the, quote, capitalist class, end quote, are devoid of content, end quote. According to Castoriadis, the emergence of bureaucratic capitalism cannot be interpreted based only on an analysis of production and economy. In countries such as Russia and China, the bureaucracy came to power based on its political dominance and later on created the material relations of production. In this sense, these countries belong, quote, to the same social historical universe as the, quote, Western style, end quote, countries, that of bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, not because, quote, there would have been domination of the capital, end quote, but as a result of the penetration into them, quote, of the social imaginary significations of capitalism and of the corresponding institutional and organizational types. Quote, Marxist, end quote, ideology, political party, quote, progress, end quote, production, end quote, and so on, end quote. Castoriadis. In contradistinction to, quote, state capitalist, end quote, theory, the approach taken by Castoriadis is concerned with showing that, quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, is, quote, neither a mere variant of traditional capitalism nor a moment in the, quote, organic, end quote, evolution of capitalism. Belonging to the social historical universe of capitalism, it also represents a rupture and a new historical creation, end quote. Given this line of analysis, Castoriadis stressed that, quote, the Russian regime belongs to the social historical universe of capitalism because the magma of social imaginary significations that animate its institution and are realized in and through this institution is the very same one that arises in history with and through capitalism, end quote. To put it in other words, for Castoriadis, both the Soviet Union and the Western regime shared and based their function on common ideas and significations such as the, quote, unlimited expansion of the forces of production, the obsessive preoccupation with, quote, development, end quote, pseudo-rational, quote, technical progress, end quote, production, and, quote, the economy, end quote, quote, rationalization, end quote, and control of all activities, the ever-heightened division of tasks, organization as end in itself, and so on, end quote. Following Castoriadis' view, the, quote, junction point, end quote, of these social imaginary significations could be traced to the imaginary signification of, quote, rational, end quote, mastery, which is, quote, central in Marx, end quote, and through which his thought, quote, remains anchored in the capitalist universe, end quote. It is this latter point that plays a double role in Castoriadis' development of his thought, as it provides the basis for Castoriadis' critique of Marx and correlates the Marxian doctrine with the rise of bureaucracy in the USSR. What he appears to be arguing is that the signification of, quote, rational, end quote, mastery, quote, mediated by Marxism's transformation into an ideology and by the political organization of the party, rallies together, unifies, animates, and guides the bureaucracy as it comes to dominate society, in the specific institution of its regime and in the management of the latter, end quote. On this basis, Castoriadis takes the argument a step further and argues that, quote, Capital, the book, Marx's Capital, is to be read in the light of Russia and not Russia in the light of capital, end quote. In his attempt to explain Stalinism and the degeneration of the Russian Revolution into the Stalinist system, Castoriadis opined that the Bolshevik Party and its ideology played a very significant role in the birth of the Soviet bureaucracy. Quote, contrary to the prevailing mythology, end quote, for Castoriadis, quote, it was not in 1927 or in 1923 or even in 1921 that the game was played and lost, but much earlier during the period from 1918 to 1920, end quote. This period was marked by the establishment of the Bolshevik Party in power, which went along with the suppression of the proletarian struggles. It was also characterized by the struggle between the workers' opposition and the Bolshevik leadership. This struggle reflected a similar struggle of the, quote, two contradictory elements of Marxism, end quote, which, quote, coexisted in a paradoxical fashion in Marxism generally and in its incarnation in Russia in particular, end quote. The workers' opposition expressed the radical aspect of Marxism by placing confidence in the self-organization, self-emancipation, and creativity of the working class. On the other hand, quote, the triumph of the Leninist outlook is the triumph of the other element of Marxism, which, to be sure, had long since, and even in Marx himself, become the dominant element in socialist thought and action, end quote. At this point, Castoriadis presented the continuity between some elements of Marxist theorizing and Leninism and utilized these elements to criticize Marx's own thought. He argued that the Bolshevik leaders remained hostage to, quote, capitalist methods of, quote, rationalization, end quote, and management, as well as capitalist forms of, quote, work incentives, end quote, end quote. In this respect, Castoriadis considered that Leninism was imbued with Marx's positivism, economistic, and developmental logic. Castoriadis raised the difficult question of the relationship between the Bolshevik leaders' positions and the mature writings of Marx, or, quote, at least one side of Marx, which became the predominant one in his mature writings, end quote. The Bolsheviks put too much emphasis on the abolition of private property, the development of the productive forces, and the change of economy. Yet they did not endeavor to transform the, quote, relations between people at work or the nature of labor itself, end quote. Castoriadis directly associated Bolshevik policies with the importance that Marx attributed to the development of the productive forces. Thus he came to conclude that, quote, insofar as ideas play a role in the development of history, and in the final analysis, they play an enormous role. The Bolshevik ideology, and with it, the Marxist ideology lying behind it, was a decisive factor in the birth of the Russian bureaucracy, end quote. Castoriadis argued that the rejection of Stalinism, that is, the rejection of what, quote, socialism, end quote, had become in, quote, Soviet, end quote, Russia, necessitated or entailed the rejection of central, even fundamental aspects of Marxism itself. He saw a close connection between Stalinism and Lenin's theory of organization and made the claim that, quote, the true creator of totalitarianism is Lenin, end quote, since, quote, it was Lenin himself who created the institution without which totalitarianism is inconceivable, and which is today falling into ruin, the totalitarian party, the Leninist party, which is, all rolled into one, ideological church, militant army, state apparatus already in noose, when it still is held, quote, in a taxi carriage, end quote, and factory where each has his place in a strict hierarchy with a strict division of labor, end quote. Such a party also promotes totalitarian practices and keeps workers in subjection. In his critique, Castoriadis held the opinion that the Leninist party was a capitalist model of organization divided into directors and performers, rulers, and ruled. Orthodoxy, iron discipline, blind obedience, the obsession with power and force for the sake of force were the elements that became dominant within the party-state mechanism. During the Stalinist period, all these characteristics were carried to the limit, and under Stalin, the Leninist project, quote, attained its extreme and demented form, end quote. In a critical reading of Hannah Arendt's work on the issue of totalitarianism, Castoriadis stressed what, in his point of view, were the most important limitations of Arendt's analysis. Arendt's definition of the, quote, classical, end quote, form of totalitarianism, despite its merits, could not be equally applied to explain the course of the Soviet regime after the death of Stalin. The weakness of her analysis lies in the, quote, exclusive concentration on Stalin's absolute power and or the similarities with Nazi totalitarianism, end quote. According to Castoriadis, the failure of Stalinist totalitarianism after 1953 was inseparably interconnected with the failure of the Bolshevik Party. This meant that the Stalinist regime was, quote, unable to reproduce itself, end quote, and at the same time it proved unable to, quote, produce a Stalin II, end quote, and construct, quote, a delirious reality, end quote. The Stalinist system, especially after the fall of Khrushchev in 1964, appeared to be incapable of introducing substantial economic and social reforms, and the party proved unable to self-reform owing to three determining factors. First, this process of self-reform could imply, quote, a self-liquidation of huge parts of the established bureaucracy, end quote. Second, the party bureaucrats were devoid of the new, quote, required ideas, end quote. And third, Russian society was lacking the, quote, new cadres, end quote, urgently needed to fight against the old bureaucracy and implement rapid and effective reform policies. In order to preserve a link with his former analysis of total bureaucratic capitalism, Castoriadis opined that the Soviet regime could be comprehended as a combination of three substantial factors: the existence of capitalism and its imaginary significations of instrumental rationality within production, the totalitarian logic expressed by the Leninist concept of the party, and the strong residual influences coming from the Tsarist period, attitudes, mentalities, and so on. In this respect, he called the Russian regime a, quote, total and totalitarian bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. Finally, most likely under the influence of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and a delirium of anti-Sovietism that echoed the American interpretation of the USSR during the Cold War period, Castoriadis maintained that a, quote, military sub-society, end quote, had emerged within the bureaucratic Soviet society. This, quote, military sub-society, end quote, constituted a new social and historical formation, a stateocracy. As Castoriadis put it, quote, this military sub-society is the only really live force in Russia, the only animated and only effective sector of Russian society. In Russia, nothing ever happens except new military developments and, quote, moves, end quote, in international politics. This military sub-society exists in symbiosis, rather perhaps in commensality, with a party which, for all social and historical purposes, except repression, is a living corpse, end quote. Based on its military superiority, the Soviet regime presented a deadly threat to the Western societies. Hence, Castoriadis drew a distinction between the Russian statocracy and, quote, classical, end quote, totalitarianism, and argued that the Russian regime is, quote, an original creation, a new historical animal, end quote. Under the new circumstances created by, quote, glasnost, and, quote, perestroika, end quote. However, Castoriadis was led to reconsider his later position. later positions. In his new estimation, the new economic, technological, and international developments made it clear that this constant evolution towards, quote, statocracy, end quote, was, quote, untenable in the long run, end quote. Thus, a, quote, reformist, end quote, group, under the leadership of, quote, an uncommonly capable leader, end quote, Gorbachev, came to power, bringing about unexpected and profound changes. Keeping the question open. Starting from the, quote, heresy of Marxist reality, end quote, the challenge of the atrocious reality of Stalinist regimes, critical theory needs to reappreciate fundamental critical concepts and theoretical categories. Dialectical reason confirms its substance through critical assessment and elimination of metaphysical presuppositions. It calls for the eradication of all mystifications and attempts to make clear what remains hidden under the appearance of the term, quote, Stalinism, end quote, and the, quote, surface, end quote, of the alleged, quote, actual existing socialism, end quote. It focuses on human practice, deciphers the contradictions of human actions, and reveals the social content of forms and concepts. From this perspective, a concern of intersecting problems lie at the heart of Pannekoek's positions concerning the character of the Russian Revolution and the nature of Stalinism. In his analysis of the Russian Revolution, Pannekoek appears to be imbued with the development of mental logic of social development, which correlates the advance of history with the development of the means of production. In his analysis of the Russian Revolution, Pannekoek appears to be imbued with the developmental logic of social development, which correlates the advance of history with the development of the means of production. He seems to endorse the Social Democrats and Mensheviks' stage theory of history, according to which there is an objective evolutionary process that leads inevitably from primitive society through capitalism to communism. Hence, for Pannekoek, the Russian Revolution could only have been a bourgeois revolution, as it emerged in a backward and semi-feudalist society. It was not the result of historical necessity, that is to say, it did not follow a predetermined course. In this sense, Pannekoek reversed Marx's dictum, quote, human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape, end quote. For Pannekoek, the material conditions in Russia contain the elements of its complete determination and future development. As Benjamin would say, quote, in the name of progress, end quote, he treats the Russian Revolution as a, quote, historical norm, end quote, and had a concrete logic, a normativity that was to lead to an inevitable outcome, that is, its own crystallization as a bourgeois revolution. In his teleological and deterministic vision of history, the future development of the Russian Revolution pre-existed in the immaturity of the Russian working class, in driving towards self-determination, and the low development of Russian capitalism. Pannekoek adopted a theoretical approach similar to metaphysical positions of historical evolution that were criticized by Marx as being one-sided. Since, quote, the so-called historical presentation of development is founded, as a rule, on the fact that the latest form regards the previous forms as steps leading up to itself, end quote, and therefore, quote, it always conceives them one-sidedly, end quote. The Russian Revolution, then, is understood as the last bourgeois revolution, or at other times as a middle-class revolution, so as to fit into the objective unfolding of historical laws and stages. This naturalization of historical development led Pannekoek into contradictory positions that entailed a peculiar, quote, Western Eurocentrism, end quote. Russian society was characterized as a, quote, primitive, barbarous, end quote, or a, quote, semi-barbarian, end quote, country, and the Russian workers, quote, were hardly adequate to the task of themselves regulating production, end quote, as they had been, quote, only superficially touched by the beginnings of capitalism, end quote. However, how can it be explained that these immature workers developed, quote, factory committees, end quote, workers' councils, end quote, and fought for self-emancipation and self-management? How were these semi-barbarians organized in self-governing peasants' and soldiers' committees that spread all over the country? Bound by a deterministic understanding of social development, Pannekoek reproduced the dualism of traditional Marxism that makes a separation between class struggle and the objective laws of capitalist development, between subjective and objective factors. Pannekoek rightly criticized Lenin and the Bolsheviks for projecting, through their control of the Third International, the Russian Revolution as a model for world revolution, but Pannekoek made a mistake similar to theirs. Pannekoek judged the Russian Revolution through the lens of highly developed capitalist countries and his mechanistic and functionalist scheme whereby the, quote, proletarian revolution can be the result only of the highest development of capitalism, end quote. Hence, this pre-shaped deterministic framework led him to a false equation between, quote, state capitalism, end quote, state socialism, end quote, in order to describe the nature of the Soviet system. In turn, this resulted in his failure to explain the origins of the new, quote, ruling class, end quote, or, quote, state bureaucracy, end quote, or, quote, stratum in power, end quote, or, quote, ruling caste, end quote. By using all the above terms and without providing a satisfactory analysis of social and labor relations, he argued that the members of, quote, the new dominating and exploiting class, end quote, had derived from the working class and the peasantry and seized the power positions by ability, luck, and cunning. According to Pannekoek, the Stalinist system was conceived as the revival of the old traditions of middle-class revolution. Thus, he failed to explain it as a distinct historical and social formation which should be understood in terms of its own categories and not the capitalist ones. At times, and in his struggle against the Bolsheviks, Pannekoek tended to identify the Leninist party with the Russian working class. By extension, Pannekoek failed to understand that what Castoriadis reminded him of in their exchange of letters. The Russian Revolution had all the characteristics of a proletarian revolution, as the working class played an autonomous and independent role. With their own radical actions, revolutionary demands, and pioneering ideas, means, and methods of class struggle, the Russian workers developed new organizational forms as expressed with councils and factory committees. On this issue, Castoriadis took great pains to understand how a workers' revolution had degenerated and given birth to a bureaucratic regime. Castoriadis endeavored to explicate the nature of the Soviet social formation by starting to explain the role and the rise of the Russian bureaucracy. In doing so, he designated the Soviet system by using different terms, quote, a new historical formation, end quote, a third historical solution, end quote, bureaucratic society, end quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, total and totalitarian bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, statocracy, end quote. All these different characterizations not only show his intellectual oscillations, but also raise, quote, oh shit, that's not a quote, it's dirt. All these different characterizations not only show his intellectual oscillations, but also raise both interesting and problematic points, needless to say, as the final outcome and the collapse of the Soviet regime have demonstrated how unwise and unfortunate was Castoriadis' appraisal of the former USSR as a military and statocratic society. His positions were thrown into question and came under attack, which placed, quote, Castoriadis' demonstration among the crudest speculations of an obsolete Kremlinology, having more to do with the demonology of centuries past than with the modern study of social and political phenomenon. Where am I? Given the historical and political context of the 1970s and 1980s, Castoriadis' views were distorted and misused by the, quote, new philosophers, end quote, and the, quote, Stalinists of anti-communism, end quote, who emerged in France throughout this period. The same ambivalence is found in Castoriadis' use of the term, quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, or, quote, total and totalitarian bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. In this case, both his Marxist origins and the rupture with Marxism, as well as Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism and Weber's perception of the increasing rationalization and bureaucratization of modern social and economic life, are combined into one expression. At times, Castoriadis' positions echo Risi's and Burnham's analyses in The Managerial Revolution and Bureaucratization of the World, respectively. The attempt made by Castoriadis to draw a marked distinction between his theorizing and the economistic positions of traditional Marxism led him primarily to espouse views similar to Pollock's approach concerning the, quote, primacy of the political over the economic, end quote. Castoriadis constructed two, quote, ideal types, end quote, that belong to the same system of, quote, bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, describing the USSR as, quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, and the Western societies as, quote, fragmented bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. This kind of ideal typical analysis emphasized the role of the political structures and overlooked the intrinsic interrelatedness between the political and the economic. According to Castoriadis, the traditional capitalist class was replaced by the state and bureaucracy, which were seen as having acquired an independent logic of their own. Castoriadis reversed the base superstructure metaphor, but he continued to analyze society in terms of structures, this time ascribing much more importance to the autonomy of the political. By doing so, in his analysis, the economic became a, quote, historical invariable, which may be part of various political forms, end quote. In Castoriadis' analysis, bureaucracy became an ahistorical category that fails to comprehend concrete social characteristics and relations. Bureaucracy acts as a presupposed conceptualization that neglects the social content and contradictory constitution of the Soviet reality and turns to become, quote, void, being wholly indefinite, end quote. His term is missing the social constitution of the Soviet system and obscures certain aspects of its reality. It does not explicate the concrete society, but leads to transhistorical objectivity. Castoriadis' application of political categories lacked any historical specificity. As a result, he dealt with them as eternal categories that possessed no imminent historical dynamic. Bureaucracy was considered in a historically indeterminate and static fashion. Thus, this in turn implied that Castoriadis' ideal typical analysis failed to follow the social transformations of the Soviet society. Hence, he was compelled to add to his previous approach a parallel emphasis based upon the quote, primacy of the ideological, end quote, or in Castoriadis' words, the primacy of the social imaginary significations. This led Castoriadis to argue that the Soviet regime, although it was not capitalist, belonged to the social historical universe of capitalism owing to similar ideas that it shared with Western societies. Social imaginary significations such as the concepts of progress, production, economy, development, technology, and rationality were seen by Castoriadis as motive forces of both the Soviet and Western societies and were posited in a transhistorical manner. They were accepted and used uncritically as not being derived from antagonistic human social relations. They were not related to class struggle and consequently were converted into reified and ideological categories that were perceived ahistorically. As Horkheimer put it, quote, the critical theory is indeed incompatible with the idealist belief that any theory is independent of men and even has a growth of its own, end quote. Castoriadis reduced human relations to imaginary significations and started his analysis from them as given premises, deriving social relations from hypothesized political structures and abstract ideas. Castoriadis' social imaginaries appear to exist above Soviet society and turn out to be hypostatized as enduring structures that set the framework for the bureaucratization of the world, whatever the distinctive economic and social relations. His concepts appear to draw inescapable lines, operating within the bounds of predetermined possibilities. Thus, the abstract generality, lack of concrete application, and ahistorical character of Castoriadis's, quote, social imaginary significations, end quote, not only avoided the specific economic and social structure of Stalinism, but they also pointed to the erroneous conclusions that the American and Russian systems would objectively lead to a convergence, or that the Russian, quote, statocracy, end quote, constitute a deadly threat to Western societies. In this sense, the turning to the strengths of his argument, the most significant contribution made by Castoriadis is related to his initial efforts to criticize the Soviet bureaucracy by using Marxist concepts and categories. Although the, quote, terminological question of what to call Russia is not satisfactorily resolved by referring to it as a, quote, new social form, or as a, quote, bureaucratic society, end quote, Castoriadis' analysis emphasized the distinctiveness of the Stalinist system as a new social formation. Moreover, and here Castoriadis' contribution tallies with the merit of the analysis made by Pannekoek, he shed light on intentionally neglected events and periods of Soviet history. Both Castoriadis and Pannekoek underscored how the history of the Russian Revolution contains suppressed radical possibilities and alternatives that had been obscured by the official propaganda and Soviet power. They recognized that the workers' councils, the organization of the councils, are forms of working-class self-determination that could lead not only to the overthrow of capitalism, but also to the establishment of a new society of free and equal associated producers. Linked to this idea of the social revolution by means of council organization is undoubtedly their critique of the Bolshevik Party. They did so apparently on the grounds that Stalinism should not be made a scapegoat for the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. Hence they drew our attention to the fact that any endeavor to trace the origin of the Soviet bureaucracy by focusing exclusively on the Stalinist period avoids exploring the Leninist Party's function and its role as a fundamental factor in the development of the bureaucratic class. Despite their limitations, therefore, Pannekoek's and Castoriadis' contribution to the explication of Stalinism will remain a significant point of reference for putting the, quote, negative to work, end quote, and keeping the question of Stalinism open.